been doing, especially on using code at this intermediate interface to bridge the gap between the foundation model and the robot actions. So Brian has just done a fantastic talk. I'm very impressed by the capabilities of Pi 0.5. But you also mentioned there are still some issues and limitations in terms of scaling to longer horizon tasks. So I hope maybe some of the tools we have been building can potentially be able to provide some potential solutions there. So today's talk is on from language to codes, especially how we can use foundation model to generate code to program the robot's behaviors. So obviously, everybody here wants to do is trying to help the robots better generalize to the unstructured environments around us. This actually requires the levels of generalizations and adaptation capabilities goes far beyond the reach of the current robotic systems. Talking about generalizations and adaptations, there has been a lot of developments under the umbrella of foundation models that really shows that you can push very, very far in terms of getting this language models or vision language model to perform quite well in the real world environments. So then what is the foundation models? Just make things a little bit more concrete. According to Wiki, a foundation model is a type of machine learning model that is trained on broad data, such that it can be applied across a wide range of use cases. Currently, we call many models foundation models. For example, GPT, SAM, Dino. But I want to making sure there's some very important caveats we should realize before we just call all of them foundation models. Meaning we currently have very, very powerful large language model. They can solve many language-related tasks almost at an AGI level, depending on your definition of what AGI is. But we currently do not have the most general visual foundation model. They can solve all the vision tasks at the same level as, for example, how GPT can solve all the language-related tasks. And obviously, we are also pushing forward on this vision language action models. And the levels of capabilities in solving all the interaction tasks is still has a lot of room for improvements. So what we want to show is that for today's sake, we want to call all of these models foundation models and show some of the opportunities we would be able to endow to our robots by compose some coherent system together, especially with this bridging block of codes to allow things to work very nicely together. So essentially, the system we are trying to build is obviously given our robotic systems, the visual observations and the language instructions. We want to map whatever we have to the robots directly into the actions. Like many of the current vision language action model do, is trying to do large-scale imitation learnings, trying to do this kind of end-to-end mapping, directly map from the inputs to the output actions. People call it robotic foundation models. Obviously, there's many other names like VLAs or large behavior models. But essentially, they are all describing generally the similar type of things. There's many existing models like RTX, OpenVLA, Pi 0.5, etc. Those are great works in pushing these frontiers forward. But obviously, there's also a lot of problems and limitations in really giving us this most general purpose models that works everywhere around our unstructured environments. The first one could be, for example, steerabilities. Does the model actually listen to what you instruct the model to do? So often the case, if you see many demos, you give the robot some visual observations and some language instructions. And often the times, the task is quite obvious given the visual observations. And people haven't really been doing very comprehensive investigations on how steerable the model is. And second is debuggabilities. If things go wrong, you have these gigantic models, now what should you do about it? There are still a lot of I would say research questions people have to answer in order to in order to actually move in this directions further along. For example, if you have the budget to collect 10,000 more demonstrations, where should you collect that data? And for example, if you want your policies to go from 80% to 99.99% of, where should you collect that data and how much data do you need to collect? And obviously, the third thing is also the scalabilities. So currently, many, obviously Pi 0.5 have already extended to larger scale environments. But what about scenarios that are even larger? What if we are trying to solve some longer horizon tasks? Those are still questions which seems to me a little bit hard to imagine this gigantic end-to-end model will be able to solve all of the issues like once and for all. So instead of doing everything end-to-end, we try to take a more modularized approach, where we want to use foundation model generated robot programs at this intermediate interface to bridge the gap between different modules. So why use this kind of programs? This is because this generates a type of interface, type of languages that is kind of universally used in many engineering domains. It is simultaneously foundation model generatable, human interpretable, and also robot executable. So this is this type of very versatile and multilingual representation in the middles that can act as very, very nice glues to glue different modules together. So specifically for today, I'm going to show two work that show how this type of code is able to generate some kind of task specification or objective functions. It allows us to do both model-based planning and also policy learning. On the model-based planning side, I want to use this one, like a seemingly simple examples as this kind of, to do the introductions. So this task seems to be simple, like pour the tea into the cup. But if you decompose the task into several stages and really looking at what's happening at each and every one of the stage, there's a lot of nuances. For example, at the end of the first stage, the gripper has to get in closer to the handle parts of the teapot. And at the second stage, you want to move the tip of the teapot right above the cup. And at the third stage, you tilt the teapot until making sure the tip of the teapot is always right above the cup. So you might realize actually at different stages of the task, you're actually focusing on different semantically meaningful regions of environments. And you are actively considering the spatial temporal relationship between those regions in order to do the successful execution of these tasks. So for this purpose, we use spatial temporal relational constraints as this type of representations. They can be specified using foundation model generated codes, this kind of robot programs that allows us to do a wide range of manipulation tasks in the real world environments. And we call this like a framework recap, relational key point constraints. Here's how the overall framework in general look like. We first decompose the task into several stages. For each stage, like recap 1, 2, 3, and 4, representing each stage. And for each stage, the inputs are a number of 3D key points of the environments. And we're generating the spatial temporal constraints within that stage. And then we can use some off-the-shelf optimization solvers to do the optimization to give us these robot actions. So more specifically, these pour T examples, we use a combination of segment anything and dino to obtain semantically meaningful key points overlaid on the 3D space of this environment. And then we project those 3D key points back into the 2D images. Together with the language instructions, we fed them into the foundation models. And this foundation model is doing two things. One is to do task decompositions, decompose the task into several stages. And then it will generate the constraints. The constraints contains two types of constraints, the path constraints and also the sub-goal constraints. The sub-goal constraints describe the spatial relationship at the end of their constraints, which also specifies the constraints as long as you satisfy them, it's time to proceed to the next task stage. And the path constraint essentially describes the spatial temporal relationship that needs to be satisfied during the executions of that stage. Back into these pour T examples. For example, for the first stage, at the end of the first stage, the gripper has to get in closer to the handle part of the teapot. And at the end of the second stage, the tip of the teapot should right above the cup. But during the process, we want to making sure the key points representing the handle and the key points representing the tip are always at the same heights, trying to avoid any jiggling motions. And at the end of the third stage, you want to tilt the teapot into certain angles. But during the process, you want to making sure the tip of the teapot is always right above the cup, which essentially specifies the axis around which you rotate this teapot. And then you can do constraint optimization to optimize the robot's actions. Here, we're just using off-the-shelf optimization packages. Then the whole framework is formulated as sequential least square programming. And the optimization process can be done at 10 frames per second. One interesting thing about this framework is whenever some constraints has been violated, we can always trace back to some earlier stages until all the constraints are satisfied and reduce the optimization from there to be robust to unexpected events happening in the environment. So we evaluate the framework over like two types of setups. The left is a mobile, really a mobile arm mounted on some kind of movable carts for some more in the wild experiments. On the right, we have this bimanual tabletop manipulation setup. Here will be the visualizations of our resulting systems. The left will be the actual execution. The right will be the real-time visualizations of the observations the robot is getting, and also the planned trajectory. You can see after the robot is executed the current planned trajectories, the trajectories for the next stage will immediately appear, which shows the planned trajectory that the robot has to follow. Here the robot has to reorient this book into certain angles before it can do the stowing. Here's another example where the robot had to rotate the cup, this Coke can, into certain angles before it can throw it into this very tight recycling bin. Here's another example where the robot is actually expanded with this kind of 2 times the dimension of the action space. And the robot has to understanding the spatial temporal relationship between the key points that is overlaid on the clothes and trying to do this kind of folding task. Another example is trying to do some collaborative foldings, where the robot is actually constantly tracking the movement of the human hands and trying to move the corners of this clothes closer to the human hands in order to do this collaborative foldings. Another example would be to pack these 2 shoes into this box, which also shows the type of coordinations the robot can do in order to use this spatial temporal key point constraints as a specification of the task. Like I mentioned, all the optimization of the robot action can be done at 10 frames per second, and the key point tracking are actually done at 30 frames per second. So we allow robustness both within the task stage and, of course, different task stages. And during the execution, you can see the human is constantly perturbing the robots, and the robot knows how to recover from this perturbation, even across different task stages, in order to be robust to these external disturbances. We also show that this system is generalizable to clothes of different configurations, like sweaters, shirts, vests, and hoodies. And some other example, like dress, pants, shorts, and scarves, shows the generalization capabilities of this type of systems. Just to summarize a little bit, the key insights of this work is to use vision foundation model for scene modeling, and task is modeled using spatial temporal key point relations. We use constraint optimization for motion planning. And one interesting take-home message is that the VLM generated code is very versatile in specifying a wide range of tasks and for the robot to do the execution. And these key points provide some very fine-grained modeling both for the scene and task. It has found some very nice connections with the whole field of task and motion planning. We allow closed-loop control both within and across different task stages. This is also really a way of leveraging modules for their strengths, where vision language model is used for task interpretation, and constraint optimization is used for motion planning. So moving on from model-based plannings, what we can also do, using these codes for policy learning. So it's actually inspired by this video from Tesla. They released this video a while ago, where they're trying to pack the batteries into this kind of battery trays. If you look at this video, obviously the levels of performance is quite impressive. But you will realize that this is actually really a very unimodal task, where the robot knows exactly what battery to pick and exactly what holes to do the insertions. There isn't this kind of multi-modalities that actually happening in this kind of scenarios. Whereas if you want to steer the model of doing different type of tasks, for example, in these scenarios where you have 3 batteries and this kind of trays with many different slots to do the insertions. If the instruction is put a battery into all slots, there are in total 18 possibilities of inserting these batteries into these slots. And if you be a little bit more restrictive, put the right battery into a slot, then it will narrow the choices into 6. And if you want to be more specific, there's only 1 correct executions. And obviously, for many other examples, this kind of multimodalities always existed for this type of tasks. So meaning, how steerable the model actually needs some very nuanced and comprehensive investigations to really understand what are the scenarios the robots is being tasked to do, and are some of these very minor changes in the language and how the robot is able to respond to that. So we actually start this project by doing some more systematic studies on how steerable the current like a policy learning framework is. For example, here is a graph where the horizontal axis, like here we show like 3 plots showing 3 methods, like ACT, diffusion policy based on the RGB images and based on the point clouds. The horizontal axis shows the placing like options. In total, there are like 12 placing options of this kind of battery insertion tree. And this vertical axis shows like how many like batteries can you pick from. There are in total like 4 batteries. So as you can see, like as the modalities like increases over like the picking modalities and also the placing modalities, the performance just drops like noticeably. We also have been trying to do a little bit more careful investigations on where does the system fail. We realize, for example, if there's like more options for the picking, like the picking phase is a place that's more likely to fail. And if there's more like options to do the placing, it's actually the placing phase that is more likely to fail. It actually clearly shows that it's the multimodalities that are actually making the whole learning and the scaling up of this policy learning like to have problems. So we are also asking the question, does scaling alone like solve the issues? Like, can we just collecting like more and more data and this kind of like issues will automatically be resolved? And what we find is like actually not really the case. We try to improve the amount of demos, but the performance of both of these 3 methods doesn't really show this kind of scaling that we are expected. So that is why like having the right conditionings for your policy learning is actually quite important. So this is also why many of the recent like works, for example, from like a figure like Helix and this HIRT, and also this like high robots, all trying to like follow this kind of framework where they have this large and gigantic vision language models that generate some kind of conditionings that be conditioned on this kind of lower level like vision language action models. So we also like take this type of similar kind of framework where we build this framework, but really like grounded everything using this large language model generated codes, where we have these language instructions and visual observations. And this will be able to use codes to highlight like relevant regions of this environment, and using those highlighted regions as a condition to supervise, to guide the executions of these low-level policies. And more concretely, here's how the things works. For example, given this like observations, the task is to hang a mark on a branch. You can see the generated code will detect all the marks. Into then generating the correct like code, it will randomly select a mark. It will also randomly select a branch. And based on this randomly selected mark and branch, we'll be able to generate this kind of like a heat map of this environment, which allows the robot to focus on the right mark and the right branch to do this type of like a hanging task. Here's just another example where the instruction is a little bit more specific. I hung the blue mark on the left branch. And the whole framework is able to do the selection of the blue mark and to do spatial reasoning to understand which branch is the left branch in order to highlight this left branch and to guide the behaviors of these low-level policies to move the mark on top of this branch. And we have shown this framework is actually quite versatile and reliable and robust in handling various of different kinds of instructions. Like I want to use a blue mark, put away the other ones, and hang the red marks on a branch. And in the middle, you actually like regress what you have said and give some like other instructions. Or you said I'm not using the red mark, hang this one on the right branch. We also show it can also be used to do some other tasks. For example, this book stowing task. The task is to put the frontmost book so it sits directly next to the Dubai book on the left. And the generated code is able to call some vision foundation model to detect like which book is actually the Dubai book, and is able to generate this kind of actions that will be able to insert this book like right next to the Dubai book. Here's another examples, like it can highlight the red book and also like be able to insert this book in the right like slot. For example, here the instruction is specifically to insert the book on the left side of this vintage farmhouse. And obviously, it can also very, very nicely with this kind of battery packing task. For example, the rightmost one is to put the frontmost battery into the slots on the left column, and maybe you can say, okay, I retract, like, it actually should be the right columns. And we'll be able to generate the correct heat map using this foundation model generate codes and synthesize the robot's actions of successfully doing this task. So this is also really a way of leveraging modules for their strengths, where vision language model is used for doing task interpretations and also highlights the right regions of the environment for the robot to focus on. And this kind of low-level policy is able to do this kind of context-enriched manipulation, both for the stowing task and also for the battery insertion tasks. And we also evaluated it on many other scenarios, please check the videos on our website. So more interestingly, we actually have an online demos. You will be able to play with it. For example, here you are just given inputs your language instructions, even some free-form language instructions on our web browsers. We'll be able to generate this heat map. And on the bottom left, we're also showing this intermediate results of our generated codes for you to check whether the code actually makes sense or not. This is the interpretabilities that we are talking about. So to summarize a little bit, the take-home message is that the language ambiguities remains to be actually a major challenge for the vision language action models to actually be used in our unstructured and complicated environments. And we actually require systematic investigation into the model steerabilities. And I don't think there's really this kind of systematic and comprehensive studies that's actually easier for us to understand how steerable these models are. And how to scale continues to be one of the major bottlenecks, like I mentioned. If you are budgeted, if you want to achieve specific success rates, those are actually the issues we have to tackle. And we have to be more clever and smart in how we are scaling up. And we have to think about whether there's kind of conditionings that help us better understanding which way and where should we to do the scaling up. And choosing the right condition actually goes a long way for both steerabilities and debuggabilities. And this has been the two major opportunities we identify of using this foundation model generated codes, both for model-based planning and policy learnings. Going forward, obviously we want to scale up to larger scale environments and longer horizon tasks. And I believe many of the investigations, especially on building larger scale scene graph, especially some kind of action conditioned scene graph, could be some very nice representations for us to really moving this kind of vision language action models to larger scale environments. Again, it's just very, very hard for me to just imagine this gigantic end-to-end model will be able to really deploy it in this kind of scenarios. Some kind of structures, I believe, has to be in place for us to do this kind of scaling up and large-scale deployments. Another thing that I'm personally very, very interested in is about this kind of interplay between robot programs and these VOAs. For example, robot programs can help the VOA to find the right conditioning, task interpretation, task planning, replanning, provide this kind of interpretabilities, also give us this kind of hierarchical designs, and then also potentially of doing large-scale data generations in simulation or in the real world for us to obtain this kind of training data for the VOA. On the other hand, vision language action model can provide this dexterities and low-level robustness that's just this kind of programs is not able to achieve. It also provides this kind of APIs or building block for us to understand at which levels of abstraction should we build and bridge between different kind of modules. And it can also give us some very nice initialization, some reasonable initial behaviors for us to understand what kind of data makes the most sense, what type of distribution should we cover. And really moving us to the futures where we can achieve this general robotic intelligence as the robot can work around us in unstructured environments. In the end, I want to thank all the collaborators and also the funding agencies for my lab. Without them, it would be impossible to do all the work. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
I was curious when you use code as the intermediate representation, how much structure or pre-context do you need to put in? Are you giving a language for it to do that interface in, or is it kind of just generating on its own?
Yeah, for this kind of code generations, obviously you have to give the foundation model some kind of prompts for you to get something back. You have to give the foundation model some examples and in order to generate the right type of templates you want. So over the time, it could also be we are better and better at how we do prompting. It also be because like the foundation model are now actually becomes more and more stronger. So what we find is that we spend actually like less and less effort on to prompt the foundation models. And many of the work, as you can see, is still somewhat empirical. So we try to be a little bit more rigorous by doing very careful like error breakdowns to understand, for example, where the error coming from. Currently, what we realize is that the majority of the errors are just actually not coming from those foundation models. The majority of the errors are still coming from the perception modules. It's actually the current vision language model that are not good enough. That's a major bottleneck of this whole framework instead of actually in the code generation parts. Okay, thank you.